Hey guys, tonight we're starting with a house that's elegant, candlelit, and quietly homicidal. The Victorian home. It's all polished furniture, fine wallpapers, and death hidden away in every single detail. So before you get too comfortable, maybe take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only do it if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so fascinating to see who's joining us from all over the world. Now go ahead and dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Step into a respectable Victorian townhouse, and you'll feel it almost immediately. That faint smell of lavender, pride, and something quietly trying to kill you. The air just hums with the confidence of an empire that truly believed science could fix anything, except for common sense. Everything in sight gleams. The mahogany furniture is polished until you can practically see your own reflection. A nice touch, really, considering it's probably the last clear image your lungs will ever get to process. Thick velvet curtains block out both the sunlight and any fresh air, creating the perfect atmosphere for fainting in style. Every corner looks like it's been dusted with progress, and it usually has, in the form of arsenic. In the Victorian mind, domestic comfort was nothing less than a moral duty. A clean home was supposed to mean a pure soul. A pure soul, apparently, meant filling your house with experimental chemicals and just calling it good taste. To live well was to die fashionably, and the middle class was absolutely determined to do both. Coal fires coughed out soot like dying dragons. Gas lamps whispered poison right into the air. And the wallpapers released microscopic death with all the enthusiasm of a scented candle. Dinner guests would complement the vibrant atmosphere, completely unaware they were inhaling the very same compound used to kill rats and cheating spouses. The furniture wasn't safe either. The upholstery was stuffed with horsehair, treated with formaldehyde, and weighed down with iron nails, perfect for surviving exactly one generation before it all collapsed into dust and regret. Rugs were tripping hazards waiting to happen. Floors were waxed to a lethal shine, and the staircases were built just narrow enough to ensure an instant widowhood. Cleaning the house didn't really help much. The new miracle cleaning agents could burn right through grime, and also skin. Housewives scrubbed away until their hands glowed red with the satisfaction of industrial poisoning. Nothing said, "I love my family," quite like slowly dissolving your own epidermis in the name of hygiene. And yet the Victorians absolutely loved it. They called it modern living. To them, these homes were monuments to progress, glowing with gaslight and optimism, and occasionally actual combustion. So the next time you picture the Victorian era as gentile and romantic, just remember, beneath all the lace and manners was a house so full of poison it could kill you before you even had breakfast. But at least you'd die in a room that matched the drapes. If the Victorian home had a favorite color, it was death. Specifically, a cheerful shade of green. Not the natural, gentle green of meadows and mint leaves, but Scheele's green. It was a brilliant, luminous pigment that owed its incredible charm to one simple ingredient, arsenic. Invented in the late 18th century, it quickly became the most fashionable color of the 19th. Every respectable family wanted their parlor walls to shimmer with it. Children's bedrooms, drawing rooms, and even ball gowns glowed with that soft, toxic sheen. It was the color of envy, elegance, and chronic respiratory distress. When it was burned under candlelight, arsenic green wallpaper didn't just look beautiful. It performed. The heat loosened tiny particles of poison that drifted gently through the air, landing on teacups, furniture, and of course, lungs. Guests would often comment, "The room feels so alive." And it was, at least in the microbial sense. Doctors just couldn't figure it out. Families kept mysteriously coughing, vomiting, and dying. But the idea that your interior decoration could be lethal just sounded absurd. After all, beauty was progress, and progress never killed anyone, except for, well, nearly everyone. By the 1860s, reports started piling up. Factory workers who made the dye were dropping like flies. A London woman nearly expired from green dust poisoning just from cleaning her curtains. One chemist tried scraping a sample from his own wallpaper and almost blacked out before he could even reach the window. That should have ended it right there. But fashion doesn't go down without a fight. Magazines kept praising the color's refreshing vitality. Aristocrats kept ordering more of it, and manufacturers, when confronted with the data, responded exactly as you would expect, by denying everything. One even suggested that their customers should just stop licking the wallpaper. It was sound advice, but it was kind of missing the point. Children's toys, playing cards, artificial flowers, they all got the same deadly makeover. If it could be painted, it could be poisoned. The Victorian home wasn't just decorated. It was embalmed while it was still alive. Still, homeowners insisted the shade was simply divine, which technically it was, since it was sending so many people directly to the afterlife. So yes, the Victorians loved their green. It brightened up the parlor, it impressed the neighbors, and it slowly turned your skin the exact same color as the wallpaper. Interior design had never been so consistently fatal. If the Victorian walls were trying to kill you, your wardrobe was more than happy to assist. Fashion, after all, was the great equalizer. Everyone could die in style. The 19th century was an age where elegance always came first, oxygen came second, and medical knowledge was somewhere near the back of the line. The arsenic didn't just stop at the wallpaper. It followed you right out the door. That stunning emerald ball gown, shimmering beautifully beneath the gaslight. It glowed because it was coated with the very same pigment used to kill rats. Dressmakers handled it every single day, coughing up green dust while their clients twirled blissfully in gowns that could double as chemical weapons. It wasn't just the women either. Men's waistcoats, gloves, and hat linings were often dyed with the same shade, because nothing says refined masculinity quite like slow, systemic poisoning. Those vivid green cravats that were so beloved by gentlemen were so toxic that newspapers joked you could strangle a man simply by adjusting his tie. And then there was the makeup. Victorian ladies didn't just want to look beautiful. They wanted to look slightly deceased. The ideal complexion was a ghostly white, which was achieved with a thick dusting of lead carbonate and arsenic powder. It gave the skin a luminous pallor, and over time, a very convincing preview of one's own funeral. Perfumes weren't much safer. Many were blended with chloroform or benzene, which meant you could smell absolutely divine right up until your kidneys just stopped trying. But the women adored it. The faint dizziness it caused was considered part of the charm. When doctors started warning the public about arsenic-laced fabrics, Victorians were outraged. Surely, they insisted, something so fashionable couldn't possibly be fatal. One journalist described the dresses as killingly beautiful. He wasn't exaggerating. Factory workers collapsed mid-shift. Dancers coughed up blood on stage. One woman reportedly glowed faintly in the dark, not metaphorically, but chemically. Still, the elite refused to give up their deadly couture. It was better to perish in perfect taste than to live looking plain. And so they did, corseted, perfumed, and embalmed in their very own wardrobe. In the end, the Victorian era proved one timeless truth. Fashion kills. Sometimes slowly, sometimes spectacularly, but always with impeccable tailoring. Few inventions captured the Victorian imagination quite like gaslight. It was modern, it was dazzling, and best of all, it was slightly explosive. When the first flickering flames illuminated the streets of London, people just stood there in awe, not realizing they were witnessing both the birth of progress and the quiet debut of indoor carbon monoxide therapy. Before gaslight, homes had to rely on candles and oil lamps, which at least had the decency to kill you slowly. But gaslighting, oh, that was pure efficiency. It burned cleaner, brighter, and released just enough toxins to make every single dinner party feel like a seance. The middle class adored it. The working class installed it, and everyone at some point complained of a mysterious fatigue while turning a delicate shade of gray. The technology wasn't entirely reliable. Leaks were incredibly common, explosions were frequent, and half the city learned what methane smelled like the hard way. Some London homes lit up so suddenly that the occupants achieved enlightenment in the most literal sense, briefly and very violently. Still, gaslight was considered romantic. Lovers would meet beneath its golden haze, never noticing that it was gently corroding their lungs. Poets praised its soft glow. Painters captured its warmth, and doctors quietly observed a city that was developing collective anemia. Even servants fainting in unventilated kitchens were just dismissed as having delicate constitutions. Nothing ruins the mood quite like acknowledging that your home lighting also doubles as a slow noose. The upper class, of course, didn't really mind. They had bigger houses and much better ventilation, which just meant that their servants simply died first. For those on a budget, economy lamps were marketed as being safe, though they occasionally filled the room with a dense vapor known affectionately as death. When electric light finally arrived decades later, Victorians hesitated. Electricity was terrifying, dangerous, unpredictable, and possibly satanic. They decided to stick with gas instead, reasoning that it was the devil they knew. So yes, the gaslight was a miracle. One that could illuminate your home, asphyxiate your guests, and detonate your kitchen, all in one convenient invention. It was modernity in its purest Victorian form, bright, beautiful, and fatally optimistic. In a century that was so obsessed with progress, nothing said, "Welcome home," quite like the faint hiss of a gas leak and the slow, invisible promise of unconsciousness. Of all the hazards lurking inside the Victorian home, none was more committed to passive-aggressive murder than the wallpaper. It looked completely harmless, floral, tasteful, maybe a little too proud of itself. But behind those dainty patterns lurked a compound that could take down a whole family faster than poor ventilation ever could. The culprit was arsenic, that loyal Victorian companion. The very same pigment that made fashion shimmer and paint glow was now slathered on walls from London to Leeds. It was considered a sign of refinement, proof that you were cultured, sophisticated, and just slightly luminous. If your parlor didn't look like a meadow in springtime, were you even civilized? The problem, of course, was chemistry. In the damp British houses, the moisture in the walls would react with the arsenic pigments, producing a fine dust and a gas called arsine, which was invisible, odorless, and charmingly lethal. Every fire that was lit, every curtain that was drawn, every sigh of admiration stirred more of the poison into the air. Guests would often remark on the freshness of the room. And they were right. It was freshly killing them. Children were especially vulnerable, crawling around on arsenic-laced carpets, napping under arsenic drapes, and gnawing on arsenic-painted toys. Doctors just called it summer sickness, which is Victorian for, "We have absolutely no idea what's going on, but let's go ahead and blame the weather." There were warning signs, of course. Servants who cleaned the wallpaper developed skin lesions. Factory workers in the dye plants dropped dead. One enterprising chemist scraped a little bit of green paper from his wall, boiled it, inhaled the steam, and nearly joined his ancestors. His report was widely ignored because, well, the wallpaper really was rather pretty. Manufacturers denied everything. It's perfectly safe, they insisted, unless you eat it in large quantities, which was technically true, but it missed the part about breathing it. When critics pushed back, they just rebranded the arsenic colors as Paris green, because if it sounds fancy enough, no one asks any questions. So the papers stayed up, the curtains stayed drawn, and the guests kept complimenting the decor while slowly turning the same shade as the wallpaper. If hell had an interior designer, he would have been a Victorian, and his greatest masterpiece would have been the parlor wall. It was tasteful, floral, and coughed poison into the air at just the right rate to keep you fashionable right until the very end. The Victorians were a lot of things: industrious, moralistic, emotionally repressed, but above all, they were clean. Or rather, they were desperately trying to be. Dirt was no longer just unpleasant. It was ungodly. A single speck of grime suggested moral decay, and a smudge on the silverware could damn your reputation faster than adultery could. So they cleaned endlessly, obsessively, and of course fatally. When industrial chemists began to mass-produce cleaning products, Victorians embraced them with the kind of enthusiasm you see from people who have never read a warning label. Coal tar phenol ammonia. If it stung, burned, or dissolved something, it must be working. Housewives scrubbed until their hands looked like unfinished anatomy sketches. One popular product, carbolic acid, was hailed as a miracle disinfectant. Hospitals used it, and so did homemakers. A few drops diluted in water could sterilize any surface, or blind you if you happened to splash it. It had a pleasant smell, too, if you enjoyed the scent of antiseptic despair. Then there was chlorine bleach, which Victorians used as if they were trying to personally assassinate bacteria. When mixed with other common cleaners, it produced chlorine gas, the very same compound that was later weaponized in World War I. But that didn't stop anyone. If your kitchen didn't sting the eyes and burn the throat, it simply wasn't clean enough. Mercury soaps and ammonia polishes followed, giving homes the freshly embalmed aroma of progress. Housewives inhaled daily chemical cocktails that were strong enough to fumigate an entire opera house. The more it hurt, the better it felt. Pain, after all, meant purity. And Victorians loved nothing more than suffering with a moral purpose. Even the laundry was dangerous. Bluing agents, starches, and dyes all contained copper, lead, and arsenic, turning wash day into a low-grade chemistry experiment. Servants would faint in the scalding steam rooms, then wake up only to do it all over again, because cleanliness was next to godliness, and apparently just beneath the morgue. Ironically, the cleaner the home, the sicker its inhabitants became. Chronic coughs, dermatitis, headaches, it was all just chalked up to nerves. No one ever suspected the daily lungfuls of homemade poison. But to the Victorian mind, death by hygiene was an honorable exit. It was better to perish in a spotless kitchen than to live in filth with your dignity still intact. Progress smelled sharp, it burned slightly, and it came bottled with a cork and a skull on the label. In the Victorian home, smell was everything. And odor wasn't just unpleasant. It was immoral. To smell bad meant you were poor, uncultured, or French. The well-bred home had to smell like virtue, even if that virtue came bottled in something that could strip paint right off the walls. So the Victorians perfumed everything. Soap, candles, clothing, hair, even the air itself was forcibly improved. A proper lady could enter a room and leave behind a delicate fog of social superiority. Unfortunately, that fog also contained chloroform, alcohol, ether, and lead acetate. In short, she smelled divine right up until her kidneys just gave up completely. Perfume making was a completely unregulated art. Chemists just mixed whatever smelled nice, or at least interesting, into alcohol and sold it as a luxury. Some perfumes contained benzene or turpentine. Both are excellent for cleaning machinery and for destroying brain cells. Others included arsenic oils that gave a cooling sensation on the skin, also known as the first step toward necrosis. And it wasn't just the perfume. The Victorians scented their cleaning products, their starches, and even their gas lamps. When your home smells faintly like roses and burning coal, that's not refinement. That's a slow cremation. Then came violet powder, a cosmetic favorite that was made from orris root and chocolate when it wasn't made from ground-up glass. Women dusted it all over their skin to achieve that ethereal, I'm dying but gracefully glow. Many of them were, but they looked fantastic doing it. Men weren't safe either. Gentlemen's hair tonics promised virility and shine, using ingredients like mercury nitrate and ether. The result was lustrous hair and mild hallucinations, perfect for surviving another dinner party about empire and etiquette. The perfumed handkerchief was another absolute must-have, soaked in floral oils and occasionally chloroform for those who liked their fainting spells to be dramatic. Nothing said delicate constitution like casually knocking yourself unconscious in public. In short, the Victorian home didn't just smell good. It smelled terminal. Every single whiff of lavender was a small act of chemical warfare. Every spritz of rose water was a health hazard disguised as luxury. Still, the advertisements insisted that these fragrances revived the spirit. And they weren't wrong. They just neglected to mention that the spirit in question might soon be leaving the body entirely. If the Victorian home was dangerous, then Victorian beauty was downright suicidal. The ideal woman looked delicate, ethereal, and vaguely consumptive. Like she might faint at any moment, or maybe pass away during dessert. The goal was to appear angelic. The method was industrial chemistry. Pale skin was the ultimate status symbol. It proved you weren't one of those tragic people who had to work outdoors and develop some color. So, women turned to face powders that were made from lead carbonate and arsenic, which conveniently lightened the skin while also slowly destroying it. The results were stunning, at least until your teeth fell out. Manufacturers swore their products were dermatologically safe, which in the 19th century meant that no one had died today. Women dusted their faces, necks, and shoulders daily, with the enthusiasm of someone who was trying to become a ghost by sheer willpower. Some even applied vinegar of lead, a delightful mixture that burned the skin smooth. It was perfect if you wanted to look embalmed while you were still alive. And of course, there was rouge. No respectable woman ever admitted to using it, so everyone secretly did. It was made with mercury sulfide, and if you applied it too liberally, it caused tremors and mood swings. Nothing completes an evening look quite like a touch of mania and light mercury poisoning. Eye cosmetics were no better. To achieve that fashionable doe-eyed look, women would drip belladonna, literally deadly nightshade, into their eyes to dilate their pupils. The result was gorgeous, glassy eyes and blindness. But again, beauty required sacrifice. Perfumed arsenic wafers were even sold as complexion tablets. They promised to purify the skin from within, which they did by killing the user from within. Ads featured radiant women smiling beatifically, possibly because they'd already lost all feeling in their faces. Even men weren't spared. Hair restorers promised to revive thinning locks with ingredients like lead acetate and silver nitrate, ensuring that while your hair darkened, your skull slowly developed neurological ambitions of its own. Victorian beauty, in short, was a competitive sport played against mortality, and mortality usually won. Every mirror reflected a masterpiece of self-inflicted suffering, polished to perfection and slowly disintegrating. Because in the 19th century, to look healthy, you first had to die trying. If hell had a catering department, it would have looked suspiciously like a Victorian kitchen. This was the very heart of the home, a place of warmth, nourishment, and occasional spontaneous combustion. The Victorians loved efficiency, and their kitchens certainly proved it. Every meal was a chemical experiment, and every recipe was a gamble between dinner and an obituary. The first problem was the fuel. Gas stoves were modern wonders, which is Victorian for guaranteed to explode at least once. Coal-fired ovens filled the room with soot, while open flames shared tight quarters with long skirts, wooden utensils, and an impressive lack of fire safety regulations. Housewives called it cooking. Fire brigades called it employment. Food itself wasn't much safer. Industrial progress had brought all sorts of new dyes, preservatives, and additives, none of which had ever passed anything resembling a health inspection. Flour was whitened with alum, pickles were dyed with copper sulfate, and sweets were brightened with lead chromate. Children adored the vibrant colors. Parents adored the silence that usually followed. Milk was often diluted with chalk and water, giving it that lovely pastel hue and a much extended shelf life, for the bacteria at least. Bread, too, was often padded out with plaster or bone, dust just to make it heavier. A good loaf of bread might contain more construction material than actual nutrition. Then there was the innovation in utensils. Cookware was made of copper, tin, or lead, and sometimes all three, just to keep things interesting. Acidic foods leached these metals directly into the meal, giving soups a pleasant tang of neurological decay. And since no one could taste the poison over the coal smoke anyway, dinner was always served with confidence. Even the tea, that sacred elixir of the British soul, came through lead-glazed pots and sometimes contained bonus ingredients like iron filings for color. Add a splash of milk with chalk, a cube of sugar with bone ash, and you had yourself the full industrial revolution right there in a cup. Servants, of course, bore the brunt of it all. They inhaled the smoke, they scrubbed the cauldrons, and they handled enough poison to qualify as informal chemists. When they dropped dead, it was politely written off as just kitchen fatigue. In short, the Victorian kitchen was less about nourishment and more about survival, a daily test of who could progress the longest. In theory, the arrival of indoor plumbing was one of the great triumphs of Victorian progress. In practice, it was like inviting the Thames directly into your veins and just hopping for the best. For centuries, people had fetched their water from rivers, wells, or whatever puddle didn't already have livestock floating in it. The Victorians, being determined to civilize the whole process, simply piped it indoors, along with everything that was living in it. City water supplies were miracles of engineering and also biological warfare. London's system drew its water from the Thames, which also happened to be the city's open sewer. Upstream, someone would dump their waste. Downstream, someone else would brew their tea. It was a perfect model of social equality. Everyone got cholera, regardless of their class. Then there were the pipes, which were made of lead. They gleamed beautifully and they leached steadily. Every single sip of water was a little microdose of heavy metal therapy. The Victorians found this completely acceptable, since lead had been used since Roman times, and everyone knows the Romans turned out just fine. Water tanks were a whole other adventure. They were usually installed in attics, they were rarely ever cleaned, and they were often shared with insects, birds, or the occasional dead rat. Servants were instructed to just skim the surface before serving it. Refreshing in a necro-romantic sort of way. To disguise the taste, People would boil the water using coal fires that filled the kitchen with soot, and then they'd add tea leaves, which at least made the poison politely British. Children, ever the optimists, were sometimes given water mixed with molasses just to make it pleasant. It wasn't. It was just sticky cholera. When cholera epidemics hit London in the mid-19th century, scientists argued over whether the disease came from bad air or bad morals. The idea that the water itself might be responsible was considered almost rude. After all, how could something so essential, so civilized, possibly betray them? Eventually, Dr. John Snow proved the connection by simply removing a pump handle and saving an entire neighborhood. The rest of the city took decades to believe him, because denial pairs beautifully with dysentery. So yes, Victorian water was a marvel, piped, pressurized, and fatal. It quenched your thirst, it spread disease, and it slowly eroded the population, one polite glass at a time. At first glance, the Victorian bedroom looked peaceful, a sanctuary of carved wood, lace curtains, and moral restraint. It was the one room where you could truly escape the noise of industrial life and just die quietly in your sleep. Comfort, after all, was just another word for a slightly toxic tranquility. The typical bed was a monument to craftsmanship and also respiratory illness. Mattresses were stuffed with horsehair, mildewed feathers, or whatever organic matter hadn't already developed its own ecosystem. Bed bugs thrived. Dust mites held conventions, and the scent of damp decay was politely described as being homely. For the well-to-do, luxury meant having a mattress soaked in formaldehyde to prevent rot, and also to preserve the owner in case they didn't happen to wake up. Above it all hung the gas lamp, hissing faintly like a serpent. In the glow of its poisonous halo, couples would drift off to sleep while slowly asphyxiating. Poor ventilation ensured a perfect balance. There was just enough oxygen to dream, but not quite enough to make it to the morning. But at least the light was flattering. Everyone looks good under a thin film of carbon monoxide. Then there were the wallpapers, of course. Bedrooms often featured the softest, most gentle tones of arsenic green, perfect for creating an atmosphere of calm nausea. The curtains matched, the carpets matched, and even the family cat matched, though only briefly. Heating didn't help much. Coal fires filled the room with soot, and the flues were notorious for backdrafts. Some Victorians woke up coughing black dust. Others just didn't wake up at all. In the winter, people would stuff rags under the doors to keep out the drafts, effectively trapping themselves in their own airtight mausoleums of domestic bliss. For the poor, the bedroom often doubled as a kitchen, a nursery, and a morgue. Entire families would sleep together in one smoky chamber. Infants beside the fire, elders beside the fumes, and everyone just taking turns breathing the same recycled air until someone finally stopped. The Victorians were proud of their bedrooms. They called them places of rest and renewal. They were half right. Rest came swiftly. Renewal was highly unlikely. So every night, the respectable citizen would climb into bed, draw the arsenic curtains, turn on the gaslight, and drift into that sweetest of Victorian luxuries, a peaceful, fashionable, and perfectly unventilated death. In the Victorian imagination, childhood was sacred, a time of innocence, purity, and of course, naturally toxic ingestion. Parents adored their little angels, and they proved it by surrounding them with objects that could maim, poison, or explode. Nothing said, "I love you," quite like a lead-painted rattle. Children's toys were absolute masterpieces of industrial optimism. Tin soldiers gleamed with lead paint. Dolls blushed with mercury rouge. And rocking horses were varnished with arsenic lacquer to give them that healthy, deadly shine. Even teddy bears, those comforting companions of the nursery, were occasionally stuffed with sawdust, horsehair, or whatever the factory floor just happened to offer that day. And the dolls. Oh, the dolls. Their glass eyes were lovely. Their faces were perfectly pale, thanks to a thin coating of light-based enamel. Little girls would cuddle them to sleep while slowly inhaling microdoses of the Industrial Revolution. Boys weren't spared either. Their toy soldiers, painted in bright military colors, also doubled as neurological experiments. Nothing builds character quite like a side of lead poisoning. Then came the fireworks and the chemistry sets, because what child doesn't need access to gunpowder before the age of 10? A particularly popular toy was the Victorian chemistry cabinet, which included arsenic, mercury, and potassium nitrate, the holy trinity of early cremation. Many a young gentleman learned about science by detonating his own bedroom or melting a sibling's eyebrows. For teething infants, there were soothing syrups, harmless-looking little bottles that actually contained morphine or laudanum. They promised quiet nights for both mother and child, and indeed they delivered, sometimes permanently. Opioid addiction began right there in the cradle, but at least everyone slept well. Even the books, those paragons of Victorian morality, were dangerous. The cheap printing inks were made with antimony and copper, so bedtime stories came with a bonus lung irritant. Children would turn the pages of Little Women while slowly becoming little corpses. Parents didn't mean any harm, of course. They simply had faith in progress, and progress, it seemed, had faith in arsenic. Childhood was meant to be tender, brief, and educational. And it often was, in exactly that order. So the next time someone sighs about the good old days of simple Victorian play, just remember that the toys didn't just entertain the children, they outlived them. If you caught something in the Victorian era, a fever, a cough, or just a mild existential crisis, the cure was simple. You just took whatever was on the shelf and hoped for some divine intervention. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a museum of controlled substances. None of them were actually controlled, and most of them were only technically medicinal. Doctors were creative back then. Every illness had a treatment, and every treatment had side effects that required even more treatment. Arsenic was used to stimulate the appetite. Mercury was prescribed for constipation, and cocaine was great for toothaches and for shyness. It was a time when you could cure anything, provided you didn't mind dying just a little bit faster. Pharmacies looked more like apothecary gambling dens. The shelves were lined with glass bottles filled with glowing liquids and names that sounded poetic, until you actually read the ingredients. Laudanum, the reigning favorite, was a soothing mix of alcohol and opium. It treated headaches, insomnia, and children who refused to take a nap. Mothers swore by it, and some mothers swore because of it. For colds, there was chloroform liniment. For indigestion, there were antimonial emetics. And for the vague condition that was known as nerves, there was morphine, conveniently sold as a soothing syrup. Doctors called it heroic medicine. Patients just called it quiet. Self-medication was practically a moral virtue. A good Victorian always kept a ready supply of patent remedies. Dr. Bateman's pectoral drops, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Carter's little liver pills, most of which were just industrial solvents with some clever branding. But the advertisements were absolutely delightful. They showed happy families, glowing cheeks, and absolutely no mention of kidney failure. Even spiritual leaders got involved. Some preachers swore by arsenic wafers to clear up the complexion and elevate the soul. And they weren't wrong. It certainly elevated something. It wasn't all just ignorance, though. There was faith, too. A faith that a tonic could cure melancholy, that a syrup could soothe a great loss, that a pill could make life bearable in an age where everything from your wallpaper to your water was quietly trying to kill you. The Victorian medicine cabinet wasn't really a source of healing. It was a polite suicide note, written in cursive on glass bottles. And yet they took their doses faithfully, not because they trusted the medicine, but because they trusted manners. After all, nothing said grace under pressure, quite like overdosing elegantly. Behind every immaculate Victorian household was a small army of servants, invisible, obedient, and quietly dying. The mistress of the house might boast about her spotless floors and her polished silver, but it was the servants who achieved that perfection by inhaling it. The average middle-class home employed at least one maid, and often several if the family was particularly ambitious. They scrubbed the walls, which were covered in arsenic. They polished the furniture, which was treated with mercury, and they boiled the laundry in bleach that was strong enough to erase both fingerprints and lungs. When the mistress said the house looked divine, she wasn't wrong. Half of her staff was already halfway there. The scullery maid worked in a permanent steam bath of lye, carbolic acid, and despair. Her hands never stopped burning. The laundry maid stirred cauldrons of chemical soup, sometimes fainting from the fumes, and sometimes actually falling in. The chimney boy spent his entire youth inhaling soot, until his lungs resembled the very hearths that he cleaned. And the cook, that proud general of the kitchen, faced coal smoke, boiling grease, and exploding stoves with the kind of resignation you see in someone who understood natural selection intimately. Servants slept in cramped attic rooms directly beneath the gas pipes, which would occasionally leak, because irony was always punctual in the 19th century. They rose before dawn, coughed their way through their chores, and usually died before they were 40. The family would cluck sympathetically, and then just hire another one. She had a weak constitution, they'd say, completely ignoring the fact that her constitution had been dissolved by ammonia. The upstairs family, meanwhile, prided itself on its moral superiority. They would give sermons about temperance, while their staff was inhaling gin vapors from the cleaning solvents. They'd quote scripture on humility, while paying wages that could barely cover the cost of a coffin. The Victorians believed that service built character. They just never specified whose character it was building. Servants were the machinery that made middle-class virtue possible. They were disposable, replaceable, and perfectly silent. When one fell ill, another would just take her place, as if the house itself demanded a fresh sacrifice in order to remain spotless. And yet, despite all the misery, many of them stayed. Where else was there to go? The factories were worse. The streets were final. At least here, beneath the gaslight and the arsenic wallpaper, death came with 3 meals a day and the faint comfort of dying in a uniform. If hell had manners, it would have been a Victorian home. Every hallway whispered refinement, every object gleamed with progress, and nearly everything inside could kill you before supper. It wasn't chaos. It was a curated catastrophe. The great irony of the 19th century is that it wanted so badly to be clean, civilized, and eternal. And in the process, it managed to invent indoor chemical warfare. There was arsenic on the walls, lead in the pipes, mercury in the powder, and morphine in the nursery. Death didn't knock on the door. It was already on the guest list. Yet no one really saw it that way. The Victorians absolutely adored their homes. They were proud of them, every single poisonous inch. A perfect parlor was proof of your moral superiority. And if that parlor occasionally emitted a faint, choking vapor, well, one must always suffer for good taste. Guests might faint mid-conversation, but fainting was fashionable. There was a grim kind of optimism to it all. That distinctive Victorian faith in progress, even when that progress came with lesions. A society that could turn rat poison into wall art and chloroform into perfume, truly believed that it was unstoppable. And in a way it was. Nothing could stop it except for its own plumbing. The modern age that they all dreamed of did arrive eventually. It was cleaner, safer, and brighter. But it came built on a century of corpses who died elegantly at home, surrounded by matching curtains. When the last gaslight was finally replaced by electricity and arsenic wallpaper quietly disappeared from the catalogs, no one ever issued an apology. They simply redecorated. We like to imagine them as being naive. But maybe they weren't. Perhaps the Victorians knew exactly what they were doing. That the same drive to purify, to perfect, and to progress is always just a prettier name for destruction. Maybe they understood that beauty kills, that comfort corrupts, and that no civilization ever dies ugly. And so the great domestic apocalypse went completely unnoticed. There were no wars, no riots, just a quiet, Gentile extinction happening behind lace curtains. The empire may have ruled the world, but it couldn't conquer its own living room. In the end, the Victorian home wasn't a house. It was a slow-motion obituary with great interior design. In Sparta, hair was never just hair. It was a declaration. The Spartans' long mane wasn't about fashion or personal style. It was a living symbol of pride, freedom, and defiance. When most Greek men trimmed their hair short to project an image of discipline, Spartans let theirs grow wild and long, believing that beauty itself was a reflection of strength. A man's hair was his battle flag, flowing out behind him as he charged into the enemy lines, glinting in the sunlight like a crimson-tinted halo of courage. From a very young age, Spartan boys were taught that grooming was not about vanity. It was about discipline. The Agoge, their brutal, state-run education system, drilled this idea into every single recruit. Before a battle, warriors would brush and braid their hair, sometimes coating it with olive oil to make it shine. This ritual wasn't just about appearance. It was a preparation for death. To a Spartan, dying beautifully was the same as dying with honor. If they were to fall on the battlefield, their hair would frame their face with dignity, and their body would be remembered not as a corpse, but as an image of heroism. The act of grooming right before combat shocked outsiders. To the Athenians and other Greeks, it seemed strange, even arrogant. But for the Spartans, it was sacred. Plutarch once wrote that they paid the most attention to their hair when they were about to enter into danger, because they wished to appear noble even in the face of death. This wasn't arrogance. It was a performance of courage. When you looked good while facing death, fear itself lost its power. Even the defeated enemy would remember the sight. A wall of long-haired men, shining in their bronze armor, each one ready to meet his end without flinching. Their hair became their legend. Mothers and wives in Sparta would brush and braid the hair of their sons and husbands right before they left for war, sometimes whispering the words, "Return with your shield," or on it. Long hair was never permitted for slaves or for cowards. It was reserved for the free, for those who had proven themselves worthy in battle. In a world that was built on endurance, silence, and blood, a Spartan's hair was his final statement, a powerful reminder that beauty and death were not opposites, but allies. The Spartan approach to grooming was forged in the fires of the Agoge, the infamous training system that shaped young boys into living weapons. From the age of 7, every male child was taken from his mother's arms and handed over to the state to be stripped of all comfort, taught to endure pain, and molded into a warrior. Yet amid all the brutality, the starvation, the whippings, and the endless drills, one lesson stood out above the rest. Discipline extended even to your appearance. While other Greek city-states saw grooming as something feminine or indulgent, the Spartans viewed it as a matter of order. A soldier who could keep his body clean and his hair neat after a long day of mud, sweat, and combat was one who had truly mastered himself. It was said that the state's instructors would inspect not only the boys' posture and their weapons, but also their nails, their cloaks, and their hair. Dirt and disorder were signs of weakness. And in Sparta, weakness was a disease. The Agoge taught that a warrior's worth was measured not only by his sword, but also by his composure. A man who looked disheveled in front of his peers was thought to lack inner strength. After all, the enemy should never, ever see you broken, not even in the smallest detail. A true Spartan could suffer hunger, loss, or pain, and still appear completely immaculate. The discipline of grooming was the outward reflection of an inward control. Each morning, the boys would wash themselves in cold water, comb their hair, and polish their weapons, a perfect trifecta of order. Their mentors used these small rituals to build a sense of rhythm and resilience. They were told, if you cannot master your hair, you cannot master yourself. The message was crystal clear. Discipline in the small things prepares you for greatness in the large ones. By the time these boys became men, the routine was second nature. Before a war, they would bathe, oil their skin, and comb their long hair, even when death was waiting right on the horizon. To them, there was absolutely no contradiction between savagery and elegance. Cleanliness, posture, and poise were all weapons of their own. And so the lessons of the Agoge lingered on. That beauty was not a luxury, but a form of armor, a visible testament to Spartan order, even amid the chaos of war. Before every great battle, when the air grew heavy with the scent of bronze and fear, the Spartans would perform a ritual that baffled their enemies. As the rest of Greece was sharpening their swords and tightening their armor straps, the warriors of Laconia reached for their combs. They would sit calmly by the campfires, oiling and braiding their long hair, with each movement being deliberate, unhurried, almost sacred. This was not vanity. This was ritual defiance. To prepare one's hair right before stepping into the jaws of death was the ultimate expression of Spartan courage. It told the entire world, we do not rush toward our fate. We meet it on our own terms. When Persian scouts spied on Leonidas's 300 men at Thermopylae, they were reportedly astonished to find them combing their hair and polishing their shields instead of bracing for the slaughter. To the Persians, it just looked like madness. To the Spartans, it was dignity. The ritual served a dual purpose, both psychological and spiritual. The act of grooming calmed the nerves and focused the mind. In the same way that a priest prepares for a sacred rite, the Spartan prepared for battle. Not through panic or frenzy, but through ritual order. Combing the hair, oiling the skin, and tightening the cloak were all acts of grounding. They were reminders of one's humanity before the chaos of war came to strip it away. There was also a deep sense of solidarity in it. Warriors would groom one another, inspecting each other's braids, helping to tie back loose locks, making sure that every man looked fierce and honorable. This shared ritual turned an army into a brotherhood. When the time came to face death, they would not march as individuals, but as a single, disciplined body, with each man just as composed as the next. To die unkempt was shameful. To die with your hair neatly arranged was to die as a Spartan, clean, composed, and unforgettable. Even after the battle, when their lifeless bodies were retrieved, the sight of their orderly hair and polished armor was a haunting reminder. These men were prepared not just to fight, but to be remembered. In Sparta, the preparation for death was never grim. It was graceful. The brush, the oil, the braid, these were not tools of vanity, but instruments of immortality. Spartan women were just as proud of their hair as their men were, and perhaps even more symbolic in their grooming. In a society where women trained, owned land, and commanded a level of respect unlike anywhere else in Greece, their appearance was not a matter of seduction, but a declaration of power. The long hair of a Spartan woman was her crown, a mark of vitality, discipline, and a noble bloodline. While Athenian women would cover their hair modestly, Spartan women wore theirs loose, free, and visible. To outsiders, it seemed scandalous, too bold, too confident. But to the Spartans, it reflected the same freedom and dignity that their men embodied in battle. They believed that beauty and strength were inseparable virtues. A well-kept appearance meant inner balance, just as a strong body reflected a disciplined spirit. When a woman married, tradition required her to cut her hair short, a symbolic act that represented the transition from a maiden to a wife. Her hair would then grow long again as she settled into her new role, reflecting her status as a matron, the very backbone of Spartan society. It was a ritual that mirrored the cycles of battle and peace, cutting away innocence and regrowing wisdom. Women played an intimate role in the grooming of the warriors, too. Before their husbands or sons went off to war, they would comb and braid their hair, whispering blessings of courage as they did so. This act was deeply emotional, part affection and part preparation for death. Every single strand that they straightened might be the last one they'd ever touch. Yet Spartan women did not cry. They took pride in the ritual. To weep before a battle was a weakness, but to send a well-groomed son to war was an honor. Their famous saying, "Return with your shield or on it," carried that same spirit. Beauty, discipline, and death were all intertwined threads in the Spartan worldview. For the women, maintaining their own hair was an act of resistance against despair. For the men, allowing their hair to be tended was an acknowledgement of both love and duty. In a land where both genders lived for the state, grooming was not a luxury. It was a patriotic duty. The luster of their hair reflected the health of Sparta itself. And in every braid, in every polished strand, lived the echo of that relentless ideal to be beautiful, even in the shadow of death. In Sparta, hair carried meanings that ran far deeper than just aesthetics. It was a living code, a visual language of identity, freedom, and courage. The long hair of a Spartan warrior proclaimed him to be a free man, one who had completed the brutal education of the agoge and had earned the right to call himself a citizen soldier. Only the enslaved and the cowardly wore their hair short. To cut it without cause was to renounce one's own honor. Freedom in the Spartan sense was never about doing as one pleased. It was about the right to embody dignity. The flowing hair of a Spartan was not a sign of wild rebellion. It was an act of disciplined defiance. It symbolized a mastery over the self, and therefore a mastery over fear. A warrior's hair shining in the sun reminded both friend and foe that the man beneath it feared neither blade nor death. It was said that when Spartan armies marched, their hair moved like a sea of dark fire, a spectacle so imposing that it often broke the enemy's courage before the first spear was even thrown. Hair also marked the transitions in life. Boys would shave their heads when they entered the agoge, a symbolic shedding of their childhood. When they graduated into manhood, they would let it grow long again. It represented the return of freedom through earned discipline. Every single inch of that hair told a story of endurance, of scars, of loyalty to Sparta. But the symbolism went beyond life itself. After a warrior fell in battle, his comrades would comb his hair one final time before burning or burying him. It was an act of reverence, ensuring that he entered the afterlife not as a mangled corpse, but as a hero whose appearance truly reflected his spirit. His hair, still immaculate, testified that he had met his death with grace. Even prisoners of war, when they were shorn of their hair by their captors, understood the humiliation. To be stripped of one's locks was to be stripped of one's very identity as a Spartan. Long hair was the last luxury of freedom, the banner of the living. and when it fluttered over the blood-soaked fields of Thermopylae or Plataea, it was more than just an ornament. It was a symbol of what no conqueror could ever take, the Spartan soul, unbroken, unbowed, and unforgettable. Though Spartan life was defined by austerity, grooming held a special, almost ceremonial place within the city-state's daily rhythm. Unlike in Athens or Corinth, Sparta had no bustling marketplaces that were filled with perfumed barbers boasting of exotic oils. Yet even here, barbers did exist, and they were treated with a peculiar kind of respect. Their task was not just mere trimming or styling, but the very maintenance of discipline itself. The Spartan barber's chair was less of a luxury and more of a seat of honor. Men from the same regiment would often visit together, not for idle chatter, but to maintain the unity of their appearance. The barber's tools were simple: combs, blades, and jars of olive oil. But the atmosphere was always solemn. To have one's hair tended to was not a moment of leisure. It was an affirmation that even in times of peace, a warrior's body must always remain ready. Young recruits who had freshly graduated from the agoge would often have their first full grooming done in public. It was a mark of transition, a visual confirmation that they had endured every single trial and were now among the ranks of men. The elders might watch on in silence, approving the neatness of the cut, the symmetry of the braid. Beauty was never left to chance in Sparta. It was engineered through ritual precision. Women, too, would engage in collective grooming. On certain festivals, Spartan maidens would braid one another's hair in long, flowing patterns, sometimes weaving in small ribbons of crimson or bronze to symbolize vitality and lineage. These gatherings were not about idle vanity. They were performances of unity, reflections of Sparta's ideal that harmony between individuals would strengthen the state as a whole. What truly separated Spartan grooming from that of other Greek cities was its public nature. No one ever hid behind curtains or in private courtyards. Grooming was communal, it was visible, and it was deliberate, a social act that reinforced both hierarchy and order. Even the kings took part, sitting right beside common soldiers before great campaigns, allowing barbers or comrades to comb their hair before they addressed the troops. It was through these shared rituals that the city maintained its cohesion. Every single stroke of the comb, every twist of the braid, every glint of olive oil was a small reminder of a greater truth: that in Sparta, beauty was discipline made visible, and grooming was a civic duty that was just as sacred as warfare itself. In a culture where fear was considered to be treason, appearance became psychology. The Spartans understood that morale, both their own and that of their enemies, could be shaped not only by words and weapons, but also by the way they presented themselves. Hair, gleaming and untamed, was the first line of psychological warfare. Before a battle, when the enemy still waited just beyond the field, the Spartans would take their time. They would comb their hair, oil their bodies, and straighten their crimson cloaks. The purpose of this was clear: serenity in the face of death. To any observer, this level of calmness looked supernatural, almost divine. The Persians at Thermopylae thought that Leonidas's men were mad, but the Spartans wanted them to think that. A warrior who can calmly fix his hair right before dying is one who has already conquered fear. That display alone could weaken the enemy's will. Historians would later write that even the most disciplined foes hesitated before charging at men who looked so ready to die beautifully. It was psychological intimidation that was disguised as elegance. Clean hair became a weapon, a visible sign of confidence that infected the entire battlefield. But the ritual did more than just frighten others. It also fortified the Spartans themselves. The combing, the oiling, the tightening of the braid all became an act of meditation. Each motion reminded them of their upbringing, of their oaths, of their ancestors. It grounded them. The warrior who focused on his grooming was, in truth, preparing his spirit. To go into battle disheveled would be to go in unprepared, both in body and in mind. Even after a battle, the survivors would continue the ritual of grooming. They would wash their hair in cold water, clean the dust and blood from their scalps, and comb through the tangles of war. It was an act of recovery, both physical and spiritual. To cleanse oneself was to honor the fallen, and to remind the living that discipline must endure, even after all the chaos. In this way, the Spartan ideal of grooming became a perfect mirror of their inner philosophy. That true strength lies not in rage, but in composure, not in frenzy, but in control. Every single polished strand of hair reflected that core belief, that a warrior's beauty was not vanity, but a victory over fear itself. For the Spartans, grooming did not end with life. It extended right into death, the last ritual before eternity. When a warrior fell on the battlefield, his comrades would treat his body not as a casualty, but as a relic of honor. The first act was always the same: to straighten his cloak, to polish his armor, and to comb his hair one final time. This final grooming was more than just a gesture of respect. It was a sacred duty. A disheveled corpse was seen as an insult to the gods and to Sparta itself. The fallen deserved to be remembered not in disarray, but in beauty. The kind of beauty that testified to courage, control, and a readiness for death. Even after blood and dust had claimed their faces, the Spartans made sure that the last thing the world saw was dignity. The mothers who had sent these men to war understood this intimately. When word of a death returned to Sparta, they did not wail or tear their hair as other Greek women did. Instead, they would comb and braid their own, a silent act of acceptance. The ritual was cyclical. The same hands that had prepared a son for battle now prepared themselves for mourning. Yet even their mourning was neat, measured, and disciplined. It was said that before a great burial, the women of the city would gather to oil the hair of the deceased, their movements synchronized, rhythmic, almost like a prayer. The act was intimate, but also impersonal. For in Sparta, death belonged not to the families, but to the state. Every braid that was tied was a promise that the fallen would be remembered in order, not in chaos. The graves of the warriors were simple, marked only with their names and the phrase, "For Sparta." But their memory lived on vividly through the image that was left behind, hair braided, faces serene, armor gleaming in the afterglow of sacrifice. The ritual ensured that even in death, the Spartan remained whole. In a world that was obsessed with survival, the Spartans taught that how one looked in death mattered just as much as how one had lived. The final combing was a farewell not of sorrow, but of reverence, the last act of defiance against decay, and a powerful reminder that beauty, just like valor, could transcend the grave. Centuries have passed since Sparta's walls crumbled, and its phalanxes faded into legend. Yet the image of the long-haired Spartan endures, timeless, unyielding, immortal. Ancient writers, artists, and philosophers never forgot that peculiar blend of savagery and grace. The hair, so meticulously cared for before battle, became the very symbol of everything the Spartans represented. Courage, control, and the refusal to be conquered by either fear or disorder. When later Greek cities looked back on Sparta, they saw more than just soldiers. They saw an ideal. Even Rome, a civilization that was built on discipline and conquest, borrowed fragments of the Spartan identity. Roman soldiers would oil their hair, groom themselves before inspection, and admire the laconic virtue of neatness in the midst of chaos. The Spartans had taught the world that your appearance is the mirror of your soul, that order in the body reveals order in the mind. The rituals survived in subtle ways. Throughout history, armies continued the habit of cleaning, shaving, or arranging themselves before combat. Napoleon's troops polished their boots right before cannon fire. Japanese samurai would brush their hair before committing seppuku. And modern soldiers still check their uniforms before stepping into the unknown. Each act carries the same unspoken philosophy: dignity and discipline, beauty and bravery. For historians, the Spartan obsession with grooming offers a fascinating glimpse into their psychology. They were not vain men. They were deliberate ones. In a society where the line between life and death was incredibly thin, they found meaning in control. To master one's hair was to master chaos itself. That's why their long locks became such a potent emblem, a visible reminder that the human spirit, when it is trained, could remain composed even while facing complete annihilation. Today, the Spartan look lives on in art, film, and our collective imagination. The calm warrior, with his hair flowing out behind a polished helmet, his eyes fixed forward. It is a myth that has been reborn endlessly, from ancient marble to Hollywood screens. Yet beneath all the armor and legend lies something much simpler and much more profound: the belief that discipline can make even death beautiful. The legacy of Spartan grooming endures not because of vanity, but because it speaks to something eternal. In every age, those who face their own battles, whether literal or metaphorical, understand what the Spartans once knew: that order, pride, and composure are the final luxuries of the truly free.